I despise American conservatism as it is today, because it isn't really conservatism at all. It is merely nationalistic rightism. Historically, conservatism meant something. It stood for something. Now it just means hatred of the left. It has not always been this way. And I do believe that there is something in traditional conservatism that people on the left can agree with. Of course, I am not a conservative, and I do strongly disagree with conservatism, even traditional conservatism. But I do not find the old conservatives nearly as repugnant as the new ones. So, conservatism in modern times traces back to Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was a Christian. He based his conservative philosophy, or his philosophy of conservatism, upon Christian teachings. He believed that God created man in his own image, and that God inscribed certain moral principles on the human heart. So there is this natural law written upon the human heart. Consequently, there is a universal code of moral conduct that all people really agree upon. This natural law serves as the ultimate foundation of all ethical debate and speculation. Furthermore, any human legislation must be consistent with the principles of natural law. Society and government are not the ultimate arbiter of moral truth. Neither can we say that morality is subjective. There is a definite and concrete universal moral code that all people agree upon. This code comes directly from God. Human law and human conventions are secondary and subordinate to a higher law, the natural law, which comes directly from God. Traditional conservatism was opposed to revolution and insurrection. Burke observed that people die in revolutions. So if my wife, brother, daughter, son, or cousin, or even a friend dies in your revolution, that life is irreplaceable. And it's really hard to justify revolution or insurrection when you consider the costs that come with it. So conservatism values peace, stability, and security, and consequently thinks that we should avoid revolution unless it is absolutely necessary. Furthermore, most revolutions actually result in despotism, creating a power vacuum and allowing someone even worse than who's already in power just to seize power. Progress and change are necessary and unavoidable. However, it would be best if we implement changes slowly and gradually over time. That way, it is more easy for us to reverse those changes if they turn out to have unintended and unforeseen consequences. Burke also observes that existing prejudices, prescriptions, and institutions often reflect thousands of years of human knowledge and experience. A prejudice is something we assume without critical examination. The content of a prejudice can be good, bad, or neutral. One may have a prejudicial belief that one's perception of a reality corresponds to reality with some degree of accuracy. Such a prejudice is necessary for human survival. So a prejudice can be something good or it can be something bad. If you have a prejudice against people of other races, that of course is a bad prejudice. If you have a prejudice towards believing in science, that's not necessarily a bad prejudice. The moral habits and prejudices of a people reflect thousands of years of human experience and wisdom. We have a prejudice against extreme sexual promiscuity. This prejudice is usually upheld by religious sentiments, but is the result of real experience throughout human history. Jealousy, sexually transmitted disease, and social instability can result from extreme promiscuity. The institution of marriage and prejudice against promiscuity reflects thousands of years of human experience, and we owe a lot of the stability of our society to the institution of marriage and this prejudice against extreme promiscuity We may not know the reason behind some prejudices, moral habits, and institutions, but we must not wantonly throw them out. We must not just assume that all prejudices and institutions that are inherited from the past are the result of superstition and ignorance. At the same time, we cannot halt historical progress. Change is inevitable. Change is even desirable. Nevertheless, we must be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Before we abolish historical prejudices and institutions, we need to critically examine them and determine what the reason for their existence is. Now, Edmund Burke was also a classical liberal in the sense that he agreed with Adam Smith on just about everything when it came to the issue of economics. Burke was, of course, a proponent of free trade. Moving on from Burke in the history of conservatism, you run into John Adams. Adams was opposed to the idea of human perfectibility. This ties in with the ideal of original sin upheld by a lot of traditional conservative thinkers. Humans cannot be made perfect. Humans are deeply flawed, and we will always be flawed. And one of the important things about the way that you structure political institutions is you have to account for human fallibility and human imperfection, and the fact that humans can be corrupted. John Adams was opposed to the idea of a unitary state. He was for a mixed government system with checks and balances. The structure of the American government with its three branches is to have an internal system of checks and balances on its own power. There will be democratic elements, aristocratic elements, and monarchical elements. The Senate would be aristocratic, the House would be democratic, the president would be a little monarch. The system would incorporate aspects of all forms of government and would allow the various parts of the government to check the powers of the other parts. This approach of John Adams is, of course, a big part of shaping the American government, the way that our political institutions are structured, and that comes from the traditional conservative ideas of John Adams. Adams also feared the trend towards industrialization and urbanization. Like Thomas Jefferson, he thought that the preservation of liberty required the preservation of the agrarian economy. He also thought that you needed a widespread distribution of land ownership. Moving on a little further, we arrive at John C. Calhoun, who, of course, has you can always level the critique against him that he was a racist and a supporter of slavery, which is true, but he does have some ideals that are very important in the history of conservative thought. So he recognized that industrialization and the division of labor would lead to a significant increase in inequality, which would cause instability in society overall. He put forth the idea of what is called a concurrent majority. It was the notion that majority rule should not be absolute. Various interest groups or constituencies would have the ability to block the actions of a majority. In a society with the largest part of the populace living in cities, this would ensure that rural farmers would not be dominated by the urbanite majority. John Randolph of Roanoke and John C. Calhoun have a lot of overlapping ideas. They were champions of the idea of nullification based on the principles of 98, which were put forth by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And they held that the states had a right to interpose themselves between the federal government and the people of their state. The state could judge a federal law or policy to be unconstitutional and then nullify that federal law by refusing to enforce it or allow it to be enforced within their state. Calhoun and John Randolph of Roanoke, they both had this suspicion of pure democracy. And they had a suspicion of the democratic trend towards consolidation and centralization. So Nathaniel Hawthorne was another great conservative thinker. He upheld the truth of original sin, which is a big part of traditional conservative thought. that all people are sinful, that all people fall short of the glory of God, that all people are inclined to behave unethically and to make mistakes. Nathaniel Hawthorne argues, and I quote, "Most people can be virtuous only in a certain routine. The moral discipline broken, society relapses into its original state of chaotic sin." End quote. One thing about traditional conservatism is that there's a tendency among traditional conservatives to embrace third way approaches to political economy, approaches such as Georgism, distributism, and the small is beautiful movement. So traditional conservatism tends to not embrace capitalism and at the same time not embrace socialism. Edmund Burke and William F. Buckley Jr., they both embraced Georgism, which holds that capitalistic property and land ought to be abolished in favor of communal ownership expressed via government collection of rent. So this is called a land value tax when government collects the rents. It is argued that people are only entitled to the product of their own labor. So income tax ought to be abolished, and taxes should be levied on non-productive activities like landlordism and rentierism. So Edmund Burke says, and I quote, "We will settle the land question all right in good time. All the people except the land speculators will favor land value taxation when they really understand it. If you understand it, it's your business to help spread the light." End quote. Then you have G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, these more or less traditionally conservative Roman Catholic philosophers or thinkers. They advocate this approach to political economy that they call distributism, which is seen as a third way between capitalism and socialism. So capitalism is private ownership of the means of production, but private ownership concentrated into the hands of a few, so that the majority of people under capitalism aren't owners of productive property, but rather are subjected to wage labor as their only viable means of survival. And socialism, of course, is collective ownership of productive property. And distributism rejects both of these. Distributists argue that we ought to strive for widespread distribution of the ownership of the means of production. Rather than socialism or collective ownership, we ought to strive for the universalization of private ownership, so that all people, or nearly all people, will own some productive property for themselves, whether that be a small business or a share in a worker-owned cooperative. Then you have people like Leopold Kohr and E.F. Schumacher, and they have this idea of small is beautiful. We ought to avoid letting anything get too big for its britches. Corporations and governments ought not to be allowed to grow too large, and large corporations and large governments ought to be broken up into smaller units. When government has a lot of territory under its domain, that territory should be broken up, and there should be a number of smaller governments governing things. The idea of confederation and confederalism is a very big part of this small is beautiful movement. Anything that becomes too large will become corrupt, inefficient, and unmanageable. It's best to keep things small so that they are more manageable, and so that the people in charge of them can be held accountable. Decentralization and local control are the way to go. That's what this small is beautiful movement is all about. Then you also have Southern agrarianism, which is another one of these third way approaches to political economy. There's a book called I'll Take My Stand, written by 12 Southerners. The Southern agrarians criticized industrialism and modernity as eroding away the values upon which our society is based. These writers defended the South's conservative religious convictions and the agrarianism that was quickly disappearing at the time. Consumerism, industrialism, and urbanism are causing American culture to become more materialistic and more secular. which they see as something that is destructive and undesirable. Wendell Berry, of course, is a writer whose ideas and writings really reflect an updated version of this Southern agrarian idea. If you want a more comprehensive survey of the history of conservative thought, you can turn to Russell Kirk's book, The Conservative Mind. And I'd also like to make the observation that traditional conservatism is really based on Christianity. Classical conservatism was rooted in natural law theory as espoused by Christian theologians like Thomas Aquinas, C.S. Lewis, and G.K. Chesterton. Classical proponents of conservatism would have seen phrases like secular conservatism or conservative atheist as being logically incoherent. The logical foundation of conservatism is Christian natural law theory. Nevertheless, Larry Arnhart, a modern conservative philosopher, has written a book titled Darwinian Natural Right, in which he attempts to lay out a secular framework for natural law theory based in Aristotelian ethical naturalism and in Darwinism. And I believe that Arnhart was largely successful in making his point, proving that you can have a real conservatism that lacks any religious basis whatsoever. He argued that natural law theory is true regardless of whether or not God exists, and he contends that the existence of God and the truth of Christianity really just reinforce natural law theory and make the case for it stronger, but they aren't necessary components of it. He also argues that all humans share a common human nature, and as a consequence of which we have certain shared values that we can all agree upon. And this remains true regardless of whether the emergence of human nature is the result of evolutionary processes or the result of divine design. And really, that's just what natural law theory has always claimed. So there's also some big differences between traditional conservatism as espoused by all of these people that I have talked about in this video and modern conservatism. Modern conservatism moved away from traditional conservatism with the emergence of neoconservatism. Traditional conservatism aligned with classical liberalism in its embrace of free market ideas, but like classical liberalism, it had not fully embraced consumerism and modern capitalism. Traditional conservatism had a tendency to venerate medieval economic institutions and also to venerate agrarian institutions. Modern conservatism, on the other hand, rejected classical liberalism in favor of neoliberalism, with the neoliberal embrace of consumerism, modernity, and centralization. Modern conservatism has long been moving in the direction of fascism, carrying us in the direction of an authoritarian one-party state. And we are currently witnessing this progress in a fascist direction. We're witnessing it intensify under Trumpism. Furthermore, traditional conservatives were skeptical of radical political changes, but modern conservatism, on the other hand, is in favor of radical political change. Instead, they fear demographic changes more than anything else. Modern conservatives don't fear the Republican Party eroding the system of checks and balances, and they don't fear people like Donald Trump and Brett Kavanaugh, who were hostile to the Constitution. Modern conservatives really don't care about checking the power of government as long as their own party is in power. Traditional conservatives, however, were skeptical of party politics altogether, and they thought that all men, no matter how conservative, are sinful, and all men will abuse power given the opportunity. So, as far as traditional conservatives were concerned, checks and balances are just as important under a conservative administration as under a liberal or socialist one. Because as soon as a conservative gains power, they cease to be a conservative.